Ian Shugart, welcome to HFX 2020. You're Secretary of to the Cabinet, you're Clerk to the Privy Council of Canada. Nobody ever knows what anybody does in this world, and these job titles can really throw people. And keeping in touch with the public is actually part of what we need to be doing more of, I think, in democracies. What actually do you do?
Well, particularly during this pandemic, I do what I do a lot, as we all are. I'm the head of the public service, which in Canada is a professional, nonpartisan institution, top to bottom. So I'm not a political figure, but I work with the cabinet at the federal level. So I'm effectively the deputy minister to the Prime Minister of Canada and the secretary to the cabinet, and work, of course, very closely with our provincial governments across the country. Canada's a very robust federation. So that's a little bit of the job and head of this institution of the public service.
You also used to be Deputy Minister of Foreign Affairs, and I wanted to turn to the international perspective now, because it's always interesting to those of us who are not from Canada but have the pleasure and the privilege every year, apart from COVID-19 year, of coming to Canada. We come obviously every year to Halifax, Nova Scotia for the conference. Canada has such an amazing brand. Every opinion poll agency that conducts questions about who do you admire in the world, who has a good influence in the world, whose impact you want to see more of in the world, Canada always comes top of the list. Why is that?
Well, it is a beautiful and prosperous and multicultural country, which I think makes it attractive. It is an advanced economy. Um, I think also, and we may take this a little bit for granted on the streets of our cities and towns, but it is a country where our institutions work very well. We have a reputation for being very polite and so on. But I think fundamentally there's a diversity in Canada, geographic but also cultural, that has been part of us for a very, very long time. And we have somehow been able to fashion that into a way of getting along and learning how to receive people from every part of the world, bring them into our institutions and our way of life, and very quickly they become part of the fabric of the country. And as long as we see that as a positive thing and a net benefit to the country, I think we will be able to turn that around and make the country of benefit to the world. And we produce good quality, and whether that is in our military, in our diplomatic work, in our practical contributions, whether it's global health or trading rules, we work well with others, and we get along reasonably well with ourselves. And I think putting all that together, along with the natural blessings of the country, makes it a very attractive place. It's all kind of summarized in Halifax. Wonderful, wonderful historic city, and of course the annual gathering of the forum.
And I'm going to come to that in a second. I just wanted to say one other, I just wanted to put to you, there's something, I come from a small town in the north of England in West Yorkshire called Ilkley. And I was back at my mother's place last year, and I was talking to one of our neighbours about the Halifax Forum, about Canada. And he just spontaneously said, yes, Canada, it's like it's got the best of Europe and the best of the United States and doesn't have the downsides of either. Is that something that I'm inviting you to be immodest here, but is that something that actually is some truth to that it does have the best of both worlds?
Well, I'm Canadian, so I don't know if I can be immodest, but I think there is truth to that. Halifax is a very, very old town, and Nova Scotia is a very old part of the country. And you go back to the Napoleonic Wars, you go back before that, when some of the empires, notably the Brits and the French, were slugging it out all around the world and on the high seas. That was playing out in Canada. Then you visit the city of Quebec, and you would be certain that you are in old France, in a very old part of the country. But we've also got cities like Calgary, and dynamic places like Lethbridge and Saskatoon that are young cities, but very, very dynamic. So I think you've got the history of the old world and the dynamism of the frontier, and we've managed to consolidate those and get the best of those, which is actually an important, I think, analogy for democracy, which is an ancient idea but has to be continually evolving and renewed. So I think you're right that is a bit of a secret sauce for Canada.
And that brings us naturally to the question of democracy. And when Peter Van Prague founded the Halifax International Security Forum, and it's kind of amazing to think that it was 12 years ago, and I've also been involved with it from the beginning. You remember that the late great Senator John McCain was talking in those days also about a concert for democracies. Halifax's central mission is to strengthen strategic cooperation among democracies. And I think we had the idea before it became fashionable. Now President-elect Biden is talking very much about the same kind of thing. You hear it across the Atlantic. You're hearing it all over the world that democracies have got to come together. I mean, where do you see Halifax International Security Forum, but also Canada generally? Where do you see that it fitting underneath that ambition now being expressed by President-elect Biden, but as I say, also being bought into very strongly by people all over the world?
One of the great thrills of my time at Halifax was a private meeting with Senator McCain, I believe at his last visit to the forum. And that was a great honor. And we discussed things that were very specific to Arizona. And we talked about joint defense initiatives between Canada and the United States, and joint intelligence efforts. And we talked about the future of the United States heading into what has been a very interesting period of time. I would say that the most significant challenge for a country like Canada, which, depending on how you look at it, is a small middle power or a big small power, but there are many countries like us. How are we going to contribute to the global order, and how are we going to defend our interest in the global order? And no country as blessed as Canada, and as I think we frequently have punched above our weight, but that notwithstanding, no country that fits our description or is even in that category of countries can find its way in this world alone. Cannot be done. We need each other, and the United Kingdom needs Canada, and Canada needs the United Kingdom. And that is true of the Netherlands. That is true of countries all around the world, in all continents: Asia, Africa, South America, not just Europe. And we've got to be working together, sometimes on projects, sometimes on standing up and making a point about things. We've done that recently in relation to our difficulties with a couple of our citizens who are detained in China. We've all recognized a number of like-minded countries, what is at stake, and we have spoken together. And we've done that in relation to other issues. Whether it's cooperation in very practical matters or big existential challenges like climate change, we cannot find our way alone. And the democratically minded countries are going to have to work at renewing the projects that unite us, as well as the institutions that have served us well. That's what Halifax is all about. That's what we can bring to Halifax as participants. That's what we can take away from Halifax every time we've gathered.
It's interesting. You mentioned the two Canadians who've been held for almost 2 years now. I mean, it's an absolute shame, an absolute disgrace what has been going on. Effectively taken hostage. Michael Kovrig, Michael Spavor, two Michaels. To a lot of people, known as the two Michaels. And I don't know whether you saw that we put out this handbook for democracies on China. I actually wrote it, China versus Democracy, the Greatest Game. One of the points I raise in that is that as China rises, and China will become the largest economy, certainly by the end of the decade, it already is equal to the United States in purchasing power parity, but actually in dollar terms, it will exceed the United States. One of the points I make is that even the United States is going to get pushed around a lot more than it's used to if it doesn't really cement and reimagine its alliances. And I suppose that applies 10 times more to whether we call it Canada as a rising middle power, country like the UK, which is a fairly long established middle power, countries like Germany, countries in Asia like South Korea. And it really is the case that only by working together, but not just only by working together, when we work together, we are in an enormously powerful position. I mean, the one thing about China is it just doesn't have any allies. I mean, it's got a few clients, but it hasn't got any real allies. But I suppose this all comes back down to the vibrancy of our own democracies. I mean, it's one thing to talk about strengthening cooperation among democracies, but if we're not actually strong at home, then we've got a problem, haven't we? So, this problem of populism, this problem of perhaps taking democracy for granted too much, it's come home to hit us, hasn't it? And I wonder what you think about where we now stand in relation to the problems of populism and how we can overcome them.
Well, I couldn't agree more with your assessment that is what is at the root of the issue. I think I would say as emphatically as I can, and I would say this to my fellow citizens in Canada, as well as all of us as participants at Halifax, that there's nothing automatic about democracy. There's nothing automatic about its preservation in our own systems, and there's nothing automatic about it being seen around the world as the best alternative, unless we work at it. And it has to be defended. It has to be explained. It has to be taught, particularly to our young people. I talk a bit about institutions, and it's a terrible image, but I am keenly aware that there's something like institutional gingivitis, gum disease, gum decay, and it's awful to think about. But the remedy is daily maintenance of good oral hygiene. And I think with democracies and with our institutions, we simply have to continue to teach and defend and model democracy. Our democratic systems have to work. Domestic policy is an important element now of international policy, because it will make the difference in whether or not we succeed in involving citizens in the affairs of state. Democracy is a constantly evolving thing. You think about the time in our democracies before we had universal suffrage. Well, people voted, people elected their government, but not all the people. We had you could say, because it was half the population, we had democracy. But it evolved, and we then developed much more vibrant media, and we certainly grew in the Anglo sphere, um, independent judiciary over centuries, in fact. And then the cultivation of minority rights. Populism and democracy seem to be the same thing, but they're not. They're siblings in the sense that the people decide. But populism is a more specific thing that people decide. They typically, in populism, tend to reject the recipes of the elites, of those who are the established order. You know, there aren't a lot of truck drivers at the Halifax Forum. There aren't a lot of personal support workers and nurses at the Halifax Forum, especially these days. They're too busy. But if we don't think, even at the Halifax Forum, about what the truck driver and the mill worker and the childcare worker and so on is preoccupying them, then we are not reinforcing democracy. And when our institutions very visibly don't work around the world, it's not so much the autocratic leaders we have to worry about. It's the masses that they lead who will not be persuaded by democracy. So I think that is very much on all of us. And we need to understand what is at the core of our democratic institutions and our democratic way of life. And we've got to be prepared to defend it in our country and in each other's countries as we get together and resolve to fix the big problems of the world.
You know, it's interesting and somewhat frightening when you talk about the fragility of democracy. I was musing with a friend the other day that if you look back to classical antiquity, Athenian democracy lasted for just over 180 years, and then democracy didn't make a reappearance for more than 20 centuries. And that was even in nascent form. I mean, this is not something that is just, as you said, it's not just automatic. We don't just wake up or come out of the womb and we emerge into a democracy. It doesn't have to be that way. I wonder, just probing as a final question, taking what you said a stage further, and reaching the truck driver, reaching the nurse, reaching people who aren't naturally part of the foreign policy community that surrounds Halifax International Security Forum and surrounds many of these kind of conferences and organizations. Yeah. Social media and the digital revolution have been transformative, but it's a double-edged sword, isn't it? I mean, it does allow us to get to places and to people we've never managed to get to before, but then there are also threats because the bad guys can get to them too. How do we manage that dilemma? How do we resolve that dilemma?
Well, that's an excellent question, and it's a tough challenge. One of our sessions at Halifax this year, of course, is 75 years on, and I think we're taking the starting point for the current rules as the end of the Second World War. Well, the reality is that for many of the democracies present now at the forum, it wasn't 75 years. An Iron Curtain went down, but the dream of freedom stayed alive at the heart of democracy, because across our countries, we've got different views on minority rights. The key to democracy is that at the end, people choose, but the core issue is freedom. It's the freedom to invent something. It's the freedom to start a business. It's the freedom to write a poem or a composition of music. And when we come into social media, we've got this almost unfettered freedom to express ideas and prejudices and sentiments instantaneously. Freedom works when freedom has constraints, and democracy works when freedom has limits, that respect the rights and the circumstances of others. And by all means, we should celebrate social media as a mechanism to get to the far corners of the world, which can be strategically very helpful, but it needs to be restrained so that it doesn't pour gasoline on what would otherwise be raging debates. And that is a healthy democracy, because it's a healthy use of the freedoms that we fought for and that we are continually cultivating.
Ian Shugart, this has been a wonderful and very interesting conversation. I so much wish we were having it in person, let's say next year in Halifax.
Absolutely. Thank you, Robin. It's been a pleasure.